All right, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome to our Fiscal Basics Workshop. This is Bonnie McFarland, and we're happy to have you join us today. We usually do this workshop in December, but got a little bit delayed this year, so we're happy you're able to join us in the new year. Whoops, it doesn't say the new year, does it? Our slide is wrong to begin with. We're still in 2020. Okay, it is 2021, in case you missed it. Before we get started, I want to just, first of all, review the title and note one word in there. It says Fiscal Basics, and we want you to know we definitely mean basics, all right? We know some of you are out there, are real fiscal experts and know the depths of SACs and all those kinds of things, and we have to warn you, we're not going to be addressing a lot of those issues, and we will do a Q&A follow-up and do the best to answer your questions. But this is really the purpose of this is to provide a common understanding of fiscal requirements for specialized programs for both program and fiscal staff. And we're hoping that we have both fiscal and program administrators with us today. You've been hearing for a long time how important it is for program and fiscal offices to be working closely together. This is something that's been coming together over the last at least 7 years, if not more. And we hope that today this workshop will help support the need for collaboration. Yeah, that's okay. You can go ahead. And the next slide is just, these are a couple documents that might support your work. One is a guide that we updated recently. It's called Fiscal Fundamentals, a guide and support documents. And it includes some of the information we're going to be talking about today. It also includes some resource materials, including some sample policies and procedures, and some other support materials, particularly for federal programs. The other is our ongoing time and effort reporting, and it has some support documents specific to time and effort reporting. Those are both available for purchase on our website, and there's a link for that right there. So to look at questions today, we're going to ask you to put your questions in the chat. We will respond in a follow-up Q&A, which has been our practice. We find that because of the nature, especially of this topic, it's important we provide you with accurate and documented information rather than trying to respond off the cuff. And so if you put your questions in, we will get responses out to everyone who's registered for today's webinar. All right. So today we've broken what our regular workshop, usually we do a full day workshop. Actually, we've broken this one into 3 parts. Today, we're going to focus on the intersect of program and fiscal work. We're going to look at how to leverage resources, and how to do that, you need to know program and fiscal requirements to more effectively use your funds. We'll look at a basic overview of some of the federal programs and review formula and discretionary grants. Then tomorrow, we'll be looking at more at concepts and terms, some foundational terminology, particularly focused on federal programs. And also we'll look at internal controls tomorrow and how they form the foundation for federal regulations and for audits and monitoring. And then we'll look at funding timelines for federal programs. And then finally on Wednesday, we'll look at federal cash management requirements, other reporting requirements, and policies and procedures, which have become a greater focus of fiscal monitoring through the FPM process. All right. That is not an editorial comment. UG is something we're going to be referring to throughout this series. So just wanted to put that up front. You'll hear the term Uniform Grants Guidance. And what that is the short name for the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Administrative Requirements for Federal Awards. That's found in the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 200. And that governs federal program requirements. They're important because they apply to all federal programs and federal education programs. So they're fundamental to the basic operation of federal programs by LEAs, and they have to be adhered to in addition to the individual program requirements. So most of us in the program area really focus on individual program requirements and know those well. However, the Uniform Grants Guidance is fundamental and deals with a lot of, perhaps more of the fiscal side of the requirements. So many of you were involved with CARES Act funding this year, and because CARES Act, ESSA, and GEAR funds came out of the Federal Department of Education, those funds were guided by the Uniform Grants Guidance. So they fell under the guidance. That's why we had time and effort reporting for those grants, and some of those things that people were surprised were included. Well, that's because they fall under this guidance. Coronavirus relief funds are different, and the reason is coronavirus relief funds are not overseen by the Department of Education. Those don't come out of that department. Therefore, there is still some applicability of the Uniform Grants Guidance. Some sections of it apply, but not all sections of it apply. Just so you're aware, the Uniform Grants Guidance was recently updated last August and took effect perhaps in November. There were some updates. And some of it were minor updates, but a couple things. There's a greater focus in the language in the guidance on evaluation and program effectiveness. And so that's been incorporated in a number of places. You'll see evaluation and effectiveness addressed specifically, included in some areas related to allowable costs. The other is procurement. Procurement amounts were, the thresholds were updated, and there were some changes in the rates under procurement. So those were some of the two big ones that affect LEA programs most significantly. All right, so let's move on and get started. So what we're going to focus on is hopefully leveraging resources for student success. And first, to do that, we're going to look at some shifts in program focus over the past few years that have impacted district budgeting. And then we want to briefly review considerations for looking at district programs and funding sources to ensure funds are used most effectively. Program and fiscal offices can really support schools and instructional leaders to achieve their goals by helping them find the right funding source to meet their needs. What we always say is if it's the right thing to do, there's the right dollar to pay for it. And part of the job of the people that you're here today, that's part of your job, is supporting leaders in determining here's where we want to go, what we want to do. Now, how do we use our funds effectively and in compliance with the law to meet those program outcomes? And that all begins with collaborative budgeting with program and fiscal offices. So on the next slide, you'll see three sort of guiding principles that seem to, that have been a shift over the last 7 years actually with LCFF. And you've seen it with the state funding under LCFF, but you'll also, if you work with federal programs, you'll notice this shift taking place with those programs too. The first shift is to greater transparency. Budgets just are no longer under the purview of the fiscal office. And that's been a huge shift because that's not typically been the case. The next is that sort of led to collaboration. It's sort of been a byproduct of that. If we have to be transparent, then we have to have our program people involved to be able to speak to people about how funds are used to support the program. It also connects to planning because the need for planning requires collaboration. Also, the most important shift maybe is how funds are extended is more closely tied to planning. Okay? And it's the plan at both the district and the school level drives budget decisions and allowability. So on the next slide, let's take a look at the first one, transparency and its connection to equity. And when state categoricals were replaced by LCFF, transparency was a key component. And it was really meant as a check on the use of funds to support the needs of students previously served by categorical funds. So in the past, we had sort of a set of laws that were gatekeepers as to how funds could be used. The gatekeepers are now your stakeholders in your community, and thus transparency is important so they can ask questions and understand how the district's meeting its obligation for equity. When transparency doesn't happen, we've seen already over the years what's happened, and that is new requirements are put in place to make sure there is transparency. When stakeholders feel they aren't getting clear information, legislators hear about it, and more requirements continue to be added to ensure clear information is available. So it behooves all of us to do a good job on the front end to be transparent so we don't have additional requirements imposed to force that. All right, so we've gone from limited transparency under categorical programs. There was always transparency there, but under the prior system of categoricals, decisions for unrestricted funds were still made at the district level, usually by a small group of people in management. Budget information and stakeholder input on budgets was primarily limited to categorical programs, and that was mostly at the school level. So Title I, economic impact aid, you had to have a school plan, you have school site councils, and that transparency was there, but it was limited to those programs. In addition, budget reports were designed for budget people and other administrators who know the lingo and speak the language and understand the complexity of budgets. So budget reports did look different prior to LCFF. But now we've moved to more transparent budget. The next slide, more transparent budgeting. And this was a significant shift, and it's a struggle for many people. For some, it's been an easy shift, but stakeholders are included at the front end in decision-making at the LEA level, and that's what's new, and for unrestricted funds. This is totally a shift. Okay? Stakeholder engagement, decision-making was for categorical funds at the school level. Now it includes at the LEA level and unrestricted funds. Public reporting of budgeted expenditures and estimated actual expenditures, and this year actual expenditures, is part of the LCAP reporting. And discrepancies need to be not only reported, but explained. So you can see the connection between those two. And we see that in the budget overview for parents, which many of you just completed. That need for fiscal people have the detailed information on budgeting, but often they have to connect now with the program people for any explanation in those discrepancies. So that's a shift we've undergone. Some examples on the next slide of transparency include the LCAP stakeholder engagement process involving people. That involves looking at budget, parent and EL advisory committee input into the LCAP, and then the budget overview for parents, as I mentioned, which is really looking at budget, expenditures, budgeting, and how those two align and making that comprehensible for parents. Also, the annual update, again, looks at program, which activities were implemented, and budget, how were those funds expended. And at the federal level now, since last year was the first year we had ESSA per pupil expenditure reporting, which includes both district and school level per pupil expenditures. And that's reported in the what's called the LARC, the LEA accountability report card. All right. So we've moved from, and what you see on this slide is how we determine allowable costs has shifted. We've shifted to plan-based budgeting, so away from a checklist. What can you buy? What can't you buy? We still get questions from LEAs and from schools. Where's the list? What can I buy? What can I pay for? And under plan-based budgeting, the checklist for most programs, there really isn't a checklist. There isn't a list that says, or if there is, it's not as clear and specific. Particularly Title I is one of the main ones, and of course, LCFF is the other, where there really isn't. It's totally connected to the plan. There are still rules, but the focus is on the plan, and the rules are embedded in many cases in the plan. So plan-based budgeting is where we are now. Fiscal decisions are based on a needs assessment and comprehensive program plans at both the LEA and the school level. And then plans are required for both restricted and unrestricted funds now. And allowability of costs is tied to the plan. In addition to other requirements, the plan becomes critical, and it's based on the intents and purposes of the program, the populations to be served, but reviewers look at the plan to see, is that cost well defined and documented in the plan? So some examples of plan-based budgeting, the two key ones are your LCAP, okay, and in which case the services for unduplicated pupils who generate the additional dollars through supplemental and concentration grant funds need to be based on the needs, conditions, and circumstances of those pupils, and the LEA has to increase or improve services for them as compared to all students in proportion to the funds they generate. And that means that has to be clearly articulated in the plan. And then how will those services be effective? For Title I programs, schools operating school-wide programs also need to develop a plan. And a key criteria for determining allowability of a cost for Title I programs in a school-wide school is the school plan. And schools can't spend funds without an approved plan, and auditors will review school plans to determine if a cost is allowable based on documentation in the plan, connection to the needs assessment, and demonstration of effectiveness of the actions. So the question is, how does this impact practice? Well, it means practice has gotten a lot more complex. It's a lot simpler if you can have a list of, you can do this, you can't do that, go spend the money. This is a lot more complex and takes a lot more involvement. Its plans have a greater significance for program and fiscal compliance. It requires that increased collaboration to align funding with the plans. And it also means budget information has to be presented in a comprehensible manner. So you're taking complex information and not dumbing it down, but making it clear. Those are two different things. How do you make it clear? Because if you try and just smooth things over and don't say things clearly, it just raises more questions. So it's a real art as to how you actually clearly articulate to non-fiscal people, to lay people who are in your community, what's happening, so it makes sense for them. And then collaboration and transparency have to be a part of that decision making and planning. So the question becomes for you is kind of, where are you on this continuum? The changes, they've been difficult for some people to grasp and accept, and they've rocked the boat for a lot of people who are used to working in silos with a lot of autonomy. But on the other hand, there are some fiscal staff for whom this was an easy shift, especially those fiscal staff who always saw their job as supporting effective programs. We know some fiscal staff, they loved being a part of the team, and they're like, this is great, this is what my job is. So, but it is a shift. And we need to consider where you are. And again, if this isn't what your fiscal office was trained for, that takes some support to understand that. So are you in the place where your district is hoping it'll just go away and disappear maybe? And some people are still holding on to their categorical files, wondering, are we on our way? We're working on it. We're hitting some bumps in the road, but we're moving and we're working toward these goals. Or we're there, we got it, okay? And we really have a good, well-functioning team. So that's sort of the takeaway. All right, so let's take a look at leveraging. All right. So because different programs have different rules and different timelines, if you're going to use your funds effectively, there are some things you need to know. First of all, just one second. is how long the funds are available. Sorry about that. Life gets in the way here. It is, so you want to make sure that you know your timelines and you're watching how funds are going and how those funds are being expended. So you don't have a chunk of money at the end of a grant. The second is the purpose of the grant. What's the overall intent and purpose? What's this grant for? What's it about? And the fiscal office needs to understand that. And then the third is any restrictions on the use of funds. Okay, what restrictions are there on the use of program funds, so you can guide your staff in the right direction. If you don't know these things, several things can happen. You may have to return funds that aren't spent. You may have to pay back funds that were misused, or you may not be using funds as effectively as possible. Okay. All right, so if the next slide looks familiar to you, doma silence, we won't say anything, but I think it happens, it's happened to everyone. When a grant comes to an end, what happens? We have spending that takes place that is that maybe isn't the most efficient use or effective use of the funds. We have schools saying, oh my gosh, the grant's ending, what are we going to do? We have money left. You hear things like central offices sweeping the carryover, spend it fast, and the books are closing. You know, what are we going to do? How do we spend it? And this is never good practice, obviously, but it's even worse in the age of transparency, when you have your public looking at this and saying, what, we didn't get this in our school, and yet at the end of the year, they're buying all this stuff. So this is what we want to avoid. All right. Forgive me, still here. All right. Okay, back to where we were. Okay, and as we said, it all starts with planning. All right, so what that means. First of all, your district has a vision and mission somewhere. And based on that, they've set priorities. And the question would be, do you know what those priorities are? In other words, do you know what the non-negotiables are in your district? Like, we know our district would never cut this. It's not, because it's a high priority. So important for everyone to understand what those what those priorities are. So when you're making fiscal decisions, the priorities are aligned with what you're doing in terms of your budget. Then you need to address the needs of all students based on priorities. So how do we serve all our students? And then what needs to happen to support students who are not achieving? So in terms of closing achievement gaps. And then finally, how are we involving stakeholders in those decisions and those conversations? So all starts with planning, and they sound kind of like big idea pieces, but it comes down to when you're making budget decisions. Those are important to know. Fiscal considerations, other fiscal considerations for program planning are the basic program needs and services for all students. So what's needed for all students, regardless of their status. Right? So it's not just because you're an English learner or because you're other category that some special fund is going to provide your services. No, basic services need to meet the needs of all students. And then for special programs, who are the recipients? Who's intended recipients of various services? Are there certain student groups that should be prioritized? And then the intents and purposes of the program. Most federal programs have a stated intent and purpose at the beginning of the program law, when it's in law. And those intents and purposes should drive decision making. So then the question becomes, and this is the most challenging one, is how do you ensure that all your program resources work together to support common district goals, ensuring all students close achievement gaps, so at-risk students are also meeting those needs, and that you're meeting the compliance requirements for each program. Some additional things to keep in mind are on the next slide, are any restrictions on program funding sources. So you might have a funding source and you're thinking, we're going along, and then oops, there's a restriction on this particular fund. That needs to be in the back of your mind. Planning requirements. Some programs have specific requirements related to planning. Others have more general planning requirements, but are there specific plan requirements? For example, Title I requires a plan at the school level. Okay, so that is a school level requirement. Required involvement of stakeholders or committees. Is there anything required? And if not, then what's good practice that you're going to do? But if there are specific requirements, are they included? District level funds for required services. And are funds district level, or are they allocated to schools? Some federal funds require school level allocations, others don't. That makes a big difference in how you can use those funds. So important to know that. And then, as we keep saying, deadlines for expenditure of the funds. So where to start is defining basic services. So what is the LEA's basic, or what we've called in the past, core program for all students? There's a new term we're seeing is the Standard Instructional Program. And that really is what we're talking about. We're talking about the basic core program. It's your Standard Instructional Program for all students. So the question when defining that is, what can any parent in your LEA expect for their child to receive, regardless of their status? It doesn't matter if they're special needs student, doesn't matter if they're an English learner. What can any parent who walks through the door expect? And next is a step that often gets missed. Is it agreed upon by all stakeholders? In other words, do all the stakeholders and all your parents agree that this is what should be in your basic program? Or have you cut it so far that parents would say, no, I expect more from my students? So is it agreed upon? And if it is, or what's your process for doing that? What's your process for defining that so it's open and transparent? And then where is it described? Okay. So criteria for defining it: a full instructional program. Is it in all content areas? It needs to address the needs of all students, regardless of status. You need to include costs required for all students for those 3 areas that fall under Williams: access to credentialed teachers, sufficient textbooks and materials, access to facilities. All of this is part of the Standard Instructional Program. Okay. Then, does it include, on the next slide, costs for services for students with disabilities and English learners to meet the legal requirements to ensure equal access? So there's often a misunderstanding among some that for groups that receive special funding, their services should be covered by those funds. And that's not the case. The district has an obligation, a legal obligation, for students with disabilities, for English learners, to meet the needs of those students so they can access the core content. So that often involves additional costs, and those are core costs. Also, your infrastructure costs, obviously those are core costs: HR, purchasing, all the things that take place in the district. Cost to support district and site administrators in implementing the basic instructional program. So the cost of administration, you don't have a school without a principal, so that's a basic cost. And then back again to parent and community expectations for all students. Is this something everyone buys into? And the term core, I think, has been changed from the Standard Instructional Program because some people kind of took that literally. Okay. And this is not what our students deserve. And this is not what most parents would expect. You don't expect them to get the leftover, you expect them to get the whole apple, right? So a core program is not, and some districts that have defined it that way have found themselves facing criticism that they're actually not meeting the needs of all students with this kind of a core. So that's not what we mean by core. Okay. A couple reminders on that. For students with disabilities, of course, you have free and appropriate public education requirements. So examples, aids or support for students. So the district might need to provide those to ensure equal access. And it may also need to modify the regular educational program in order to provide those requirements under FAPE. And also for English learners, the next slide shows some of those, again, federal legal requirements. And that would be on the next slide on access under Lau versus Nichols. No, that's why language acquisition and content and curriculum for English learners to allow them to access the core is a basic program. That's why English language development is not a supplemental program. That's what that student is getting to meet their the Lau versus Nichols requirement to access the content. And again, effectiveness, Castaneda requires that those be shown to be, and so program evaluation needs to be another core content consideration. Okay. All right. I think a few more slides are going. There it is. That's all your core, the what and the how. All right. So that's kind of the end of that whole sort of planning piece, but it's going to be threaded through everything we talked about. But now we wanted to turn to just some distinctions between restricted and unrestricted funds. Those of you in the business office probably very familiar, but again, it's morphed a little bit. So unrestricted funds, again, are those whose uses are not subject to external or legal constraints, and they can be for any purposes not prohibited by law. So you still have to do what's legal, but almost anything that you can do in a school district, unrestricted funds can be used for those costs. Restricted funds, on the other hand, are subject to constraints that are imposed by some sort of external resource, be it the law or whoever the funding source is. And also a note that if you have programs that are funded with a combination of restricted and unrestricted sources, according to the California School Accounting Manual, if the contribution of unrestricted resources is required as a condition of the funding, or if it's necessary to operate the program, they're counted for as restrictive. So we're looking at matching grants and things like that. Now, unrestricted funds usually refer to general funds, the district's main operating budget. Having said that, various requirements apply to all LEAs that have to be addressed through the general fund budget. So it sounds like, great, we've got this money, general fund, we can do whatever we want. Well, there are still requirements. Think about Williams requirements. So those are not, they're not a separate funding source. There's something that is required, and they're required through general fund. These are obligations that all LEAs have. We'll take a look at LCFF in a little bit later, but again, this is LCFF is unrestricted funding, all of it, but it comes with an obligation. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Okay, what are restricted funds? Restricted funds are constrained and used either by the law, or it could be by the agency or organization providing the funds. Think about either private community-based organizations, local governments, private donors. You may receive funding from those programs, from those sources. However, they may put restrictions on it. Yes, we have some money, but we'd like to see it used for this. That's an agreement. That becomes a restricted fund because the agency providing the funds is putting a restriction on it. State categorical funds or any competitive grants would fall under that. And of course, federal formula or competitive grants also fall into restricted funds because there are rules surrounding their use. All right. And again, examples of restricted funds like ACES, your after school programs, your low performing students block grant at the state level. And of course, for federal, all your federal title grants are restricted. And the things like McKinney-Vento, IDEA, and any competitive grants are also referred to as restricted. And of course, we know, and we'll be talking about that later, restricted funds trigger things like time and effort reporting. And there is, however, a gray area here. And there's something where there are funds that are more restrictive than others. And we talk about there's a continuum from least restrictive to most restrictive. And least restrictive funds, you need to consider those. And they're generally used for services that require the greatest flexibility or serve the broadest population. It's important to keep this restrictive kind of continuum in mind. For example, federal law allows transferability. You can transfer funds among various programs. However, we see people just oh, great, I can transfer the funds. You need to stop and think, because transferability, federal transferability, only allows you to transfer funds from the less restrictive programs to more restrictive programs. So under federal transferability, you can transfer funds out of Title II, which is primarily professional development, a fairly flexible but restricted funding source, or Title IV, which has become even less restrictive this year with the waivers. You can transfer funds out of it, but where can you put those funds? Into either of those programs or into Title I or Title III. You can't transfer funds out of Title I and Title III. And if you know your federal programs, you know Title I is much more restrictive. There's more rules about use of funds under Title I than Title II and IV. And Title III is even more restrictive because it has a federal supplement, not supplant provision. That means you have to supplement not only state and local, but federal requirements. So you can see how knowing how restrictive a grant is helpful in making decisions like that if you're going to transfer funds. All right. So next, we'll take a quick look at state programs. We're still good. We're still good. Okay. All right. State programs, and primarily state programs. While there are a lot, we're going to look at mainly one. And that is on the next slide. We'll see what happened with LCFF. Yes, it blew everything up. Okay. Because we just talked about restrictive and unrestricted. It's very clear, nice and black and white. And LCFF added a whole level of complexity to what restricted and unrestricted funding means. So just a brief review. Started, I can't believe, 2013-14. We've had it that long. It eliminated over 40 separate categorical programs. Have to keep reminding myself that were a lot of state categoricals. And what it is a weighted formula for allocating funds into LEAs based on numbers and percentages of three groups of students: low income, English learners, and foster youth. Those are who we call the unduplicated pupil groups because each child's only counted once. So LCFF, next slide, also looks at different fund amounts. One is it includes a base fund amount and a supplemental and concentration grant funds. Okay, depending, districts might get one or they might get both. The term supplemental and concentration grant funds can be confusing because these aren't really a separate grant. They're calculated separately, but they're included in the full LCFF allocation. All LCFF funds are unrestricted. However, supplemental and concentration grant funds, receiving those requires a LEA to demonstrate that they've increased or improved services for those three at-risk student groups in proportion to the grant amounts they receive for those students as compared to all students. So you can see how it's not a restricted fund, but kind of like Williams and some of the others, it is a district obligation. So that did kind of, that probably took several years to get that restricted, unrestricted conversation clear. All right, and then the next slide just kind of goes through sort of LCFF in a nutshell, and it looks at, you have grade span specific grants, and that's in recognition of additional costs for our youngest children and for high schools. And then supplemental grants, which are a separate allocation based on the numbers of those students, and concentration is named such because it's for LEAs with a concentration of those students. And they receive additional funding. So you can see that the funds are targeted to where you have your high need students. And then there are some additional add-ons for LCFF. All right? That's as far as we're going to go with all those calculations. So what are supplemental and concentration grant funds? Unlike a typical grant, they don't include specific requirements or any specific allowable use of funds. The requirements embedded in the LEA's obligation to increase or improve services for those students. So again, it's an obligation, just as Williams or other things are obligations. The district has not a separate, not a categorical grant fund. All right, so LCFF is really a promise embedded in a legal requirement. And when we had district shared, when we had categorical, and you saw 40 categorical programs, district said, this is difficult. It's a nightmare to organize these programs, to spend funds effectively. If you give us the flexibility, we promise we will meet the needs of those students who generate the additional funds. So it was an agreement, and the promise is, because of their at-risk status, these students are going to receive increased and improved services as compared to other students in proportion to the funds they generate. So it was an agreement made when LCFF was initially legislated. And how do we keep the promise? Well, through the LCAP, really. The LCAP's the vehicle for keeping the promise. So while the restrictions imposed by the categorical programs were eliminated, the promise or the obligation remains that you're going to principally direct services to those students. So it's done through the LCAP, and that's how the LEA demonstrates that they're keeping that promise and meeting that obligation. Okay. And next slide. So some questions to ask are not, and this is what we hear, the key question when looking at LCFF funds and supplemental, and we really don't use the term supplemental and concentration funds as much anymore. We talk about the increased and improved obligation. So it's not, can I spend my supplemental and concentration funds on a certain program or thing? The question rather would be, is this service designed based on the needs, conditions, or circumstances of one of those three groups? Is it principally directed toward one or more of those groups? Will it be effective in meeting their needs? And will this activity increase or improve services as compared for all students? Those are the questions to ask, see if that meets the increase and improve requirement. Okay? So it does not impose a restriction on how funds are spent, but it does impose a requirement to increase or improve those services. Okay. All right, so transparency, we mentioned some of these earlier. LCFF transparency is just built into it. Budget overview for parents. Okay. This is where you explain to parents if you spent the funds you said you were going to budget, because the parents and stakeholders were a part of those decisions. So you made a plan, you developed a budget, you said, this is what we're going to do. The budget overview for parents is sort of where the rubber hits the road, and they're saying, did you spend it? If you didn't, sometimes things happen. Then it's your requirement to describe what you didn't spend and for services for those particular student groups, and if you didn't spend it, how did that impact those students? And I would ask you to consider, we see sometimes people say, well, there's no impact. And I would really ask you to think about putting that into your planning considerations. If you have an activity or an action that's funded and those funds aren't used, the activity is not implemented, and it made no difference, then it would seem you have an obligation to think about that action and say, what was the purpose of it in the beginning? And do we need to rethink that? If we're not spending the money and we're saying it doesn't make any difference, something's essentially wrong with that activity that you need to think about and say, what is it about it? And do we need to change that somehow in the coming year? Then you have the annual update. Again, there's transparency there. What were the actions you planned? And then what did you actually do? And because you did something different doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It might mean like this last year, a lot of things changed, right? It means we did something. What did you do? You probably did a lot of things to support your most at-need students. And they may have been different than what you thought when you planned it. But the annual update's the place where that's explained. And then there's an analysis, your material differences and planned and actual services. And the public hearing is another one for the budget and the LCAP approval that's linked together. So all of this is, again, about transparency. Okay. Federal transparency. Whoops. There we are. Federal transparency. And again, we mentioned this briefly, ESSA per pupil reporting. And that started last year, includes all your state, federal, and local funds, personnel and non-personnel costs, and again, by LEA and for each school in the LEA. It began in 1819, and it's going to be reported again this year. Information went out to district superintendents in December with information and passwords to collect the data. It's collected through a web application. So that will be reported again this year. And the next slide just shows a chart with an example of what's reported. Again, federal, state, and local expenditures, and then school level expenditures, and at various schools, broken out by shares of central office expenditures is at the bottom. So what's spent at the district level, what's allocated to school sites. And you should have information on that. If not, there is the CDE website. You need to contact them and get your password and information to access that. All right. So transparency, again, also means collaboration, consultation with all of these groups. We've talked about that before. It's a lot of collaboration, not only at the with program and fiscal staff, but with school and district level. The LCAP requires that looking at school plans to see how they relate to the LCAP and that they're aligned with each other. All right. Next slide. Okay. So again, also new for LEA unrestricted funds is the requirement that budgets be tied to plans reflecting the intent of the program. School level planning has been required for some time, but it's now taken on greater importance with limitations on, it's required for categorical, mostly school level programs, right? So previous practice was, I'm like, this isn't what's happening. Previous practice was that, again, school level, categorical, that's where instructional planning was required. LEA requirements at the LEA level, we have more limited planning requirements. And determination of allowability cost was more previously was based on defined criteria, whereas now we're looking at a more collaborative plan-based model. So just some considerations. to take away is what school and district level planning process are taking place at your LEA, who's involved, how are budget decisions aligned with program needs, how your program and fiscal staff collaborate and work together, and how does the LEA support schools with planning and budgeting. So are schools left on their own, or do you at the district office support schools, let them know how are funds being spent in a timely manner, help them understand rules and requirements, help them do that leveraging of resources so funds are used most effectively. All right, let's just forge ahead if you guys are okay. Can't tell. If you have to walk away, you have to walk away, but we don't need a restroom break then. So let's take a closer look at federal programs and just a review of federal programs, and we'll look at some key fiscal terms and requirements. All right. Many federal programs focus on the requirements, focus on district processes, and then hold the district accountable for the process. So what that means is they look to say, do you have systems and processes in place? And are you following your own systems and processes rather than externally looking, did you do this, 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 and this? So one of those is internal controls. So internal controls moves the focus from external looking, coming in, at least at the federal level, external compliance to your district practices or your LEA practices. And how that plays out is through your policies and procedures. They hold LEAs accountable. You have to have, under the Uniform Grants Guidance, you have to have certain policies and procedures in place to meet federal compliance requirements. Those policies and procedures are what you need to follow in order to be compliant in many places. It's not we're saying you have to do it this way. One key example is time and effort reporting. Under federal law in the past, it was very clear you have to do this, you have to do PARs, you have to do all these pieces. Now they're saying, what are your policies and procedures that meet all these criteria? So internal controls and policies and procedures are a significant part of federal accountability. So federal formula grant programs, okay. There are a lot of sources for federal requirements, and you need to look at them in total. And something can be allowed under one set of requirements, but not under another. So the Code of Federal Regulation provides general requirements for all federal programs. But in addition, you have to go deeper and you have to look at each program, and they have additional separate requirements. So for example, Supplement, Not Supplant applies to all federal programs. So however, it's applied differently to different programs, particularly under ESSA. So starting back and looking at those intent and purposes of the program can really help you determine if you're meeting all the requirements. But again, Uniform Grants Guidance, Code of Federal Regulations, that's sort of overarching requirements, things you can and can't do. Like that's where it says you can't buy alcohol with federal money. Okay, some of those that's pretty basic, but that's where it says that. No particular program says that. But then you go to Title II and it has a specific requirements. Title I has specific requirements. So beginning with the program purpose will help you form the basis for all the program requirements. And again, some programs include a use of funds section, and they'll actually say what are allowable uses of funds. And those are usually kind of broad, and you have to look a little bit deeper. But another requirement, equitable services. All our federal program grants include an equitable services requirement, and then time and effort reporting. Those are all common things with all our federal formula grant programs. So let's take a look at Supplement, Not Supplant, okay? As I mentioned, this is the reason it's been talked a lot, because it changed significantly under ESSA. But Supplement, Not Supplant remains a requirement for all federal program funds. The basic requirement for education is with state and locals. So supplement, not supplant, means that the federal funds should supplement and in no way supplant the requirement. And the requirement remains the same for all programs, including for Title I Part A. Okay, so there's been a question about that. Did it all go away? No. The requirement for supplement, not supplant, didn't change, but the test for compliance in Title I programs did change. That's what the change was. Okay. So let's see. Okay, we've had a test for compliance, and this test is what auditors use. It came from the audit guide, the federal audit guide, and what the test used to apply to all programs, but now it applies to all programs other than Title I. So for all of the federal programs, the basic question is, what would have happened in the absence of federal funds? And it's presumed, an auditor would presume, supplanting occurred if the funds were used to provide services that were available under other, are made available under other federal, state, or local laws. In other words, are you supplanting with funds that would have been made available previously? Were they paid with non-federal funds in the prior year? And are the same services provided to other participants with state and local funds? And that would be for migrant programs, because that's a student level program. So those are just presumptions. I mean, if an auditor looks at something and says, well, you're required to do this, it's a legal requirement, and you're telling me you're using federal funds for it, I'm presuming that that's supplanting, because you would have done it because it meets the letter of the law. Or if you did this last year and now you're picking it up with a federal funded program, I'm presuming that's supplanting, because if you were doing it, why would you suddenly just switch the funding sources? Okay? So those are just presumptions, but you can rebut those presumptions. Okay? So if you paid for something in the prior year and you had huge budget cuts, and you can demonstrate that that service wouldn't have been available, and you can demonstrate that by board action showing we cut that position, we couldn't hire them, we wouldn't have a resource teacher that we used to have, then you could rebut that and show in a separate board action, now we decided we're going to use one of our federal funding sources to support it. So that's how you can rebut those presumptions. Okay. Let me see, Title I is where the change was made. Okay. Title I under ESSA changed the test from a test based on the action to a test that's purely a fiscal test. And so the requirement's still there, federal funds, this is from the law, must be used to supplement and in no case supplant state and local resources. However, the test is now that the LEA has to demonstrate a methodology that they use to allocate state and local funds to each school, to each of their Title I school, and that they need to demonstrate that all Title I schools receive all the state and local funds they would otherwise receive if they weren't receiving Title I funds. So what does that look like? I hope the next slide's going to tell us. Okay. Okay, so you have to demonstrate, an LEA has to demonstrate their methodology, and that's outlined in the federal supplement, not supplant guidance. Okay, there's no requirement that you have to use any particular methodology. Ideally, your current methodology is working, how you allocate funds to schools. But the methodology has to be what they refer to as Title I neutral. In other words, you can't take a school's Title I status into account when allocating funds and say, well, they've got Title I, they don't need this money, okay? You have to keep it neutral. How do you allocate and ensure that all your Title I schools receive all the funds they would receive if they weren't a Title I school? And that's what is in now. And fiscal monitoring is going to ask you to not only show them what your methodology is, but actually show how it's working in practice. So they'll ask for follow-up. How does that actually work? Okay. So what about resources not allocated to schools? Okay? Because not all of your district funds are allocated out to schools. However, ESSA requires compliance for beyond the school level fund. There's no similar compliance test for district costs. However, because the general supplement, not supplant requirement applies to all state and local funds, an LEA has to conduct any district-wide activities in a manner that does not take into account a school's Title I status. Again, by implementing a policy, you need to address that. So Title I, you can't say we're going to have it. At the district level, we're going to use our general funds to provide particular maybe coaching in all our schools, except our Title I schools. That would be taking the Title I school status into account. So you need to conduct your district-wide activities in that Title I neutral manner. All right. And again, I would refer you to the supplement, not supplant guidance that provides you more detail on how that methodology and also the fiscal monitoring FPM instrument. So having said that, we have to, and the reminder we've gotten at least from the U.S. Department continually is that supplement, not supplant, is not the only test for allowability for Title I. We've relied on supplement, not supplant for probably 50 years since Title I's been around, and we say, oh, it's supplanting, and then we stop there. Supplement, not supplant is not the only test. Expenditures have to be for allowable costs. So does it benefit the program? Does it support academic achievement for low achieving students? Is it based on a needs assessment? Is it in the school plan? Is it reasonable, necessary, and allocable? All of those factors have to do with allowability. So just because something isn't supplanting doesn't mean it's automatically allowed. All right. So let's take a look. Here's an example. An elementary school was just cited for having a narrow doorway that's not up to code. Since it's a school-wide school, the elementary school wants to use Title I to fix the doorway. Now, based on that, is this supplanting? Okay, and the answer is, okay, no, it's not supplanting, and that's counterintuitive. What do you mean that's not supplanting? Because if you're allocating funds equitably and you have that methodology, it's not supplanting. Is it allowable? And the answer is no, it's not allowable, because this has nothing to do with the Title I program. It's not about your most at-risk students, academic achievement gaps. It's a requirement, it's a door, you know, so it's a basic requirement. So even though you could show your methodology, oh, we still gave them the money they want, that they deserve, and they're allocated equitably, it's still not an allowable cost. Okay. So last year, the LEA implemented a district-wide after-school math enrichment program for its Title I schools. It was so successful this year, they want to continue the program, but expand it to non-Title I schools using state funds, and then they'll require the Title I schools to use their Title I allocation for the program. So think, is this supplanting? Yeah, because this would mean they're putting more money into those other schools. So it would avoid that methodology, and it would show that they're taking Title I school status into account when they decide how they're going to allocate those funds. So is it allowable? And yeah, no, it wouldn't be allowable because it's not specific to the Title I program there, and it's already supplanting, so it's not allowable. All right. Next, There's some other requirements that were just mentioned that have to do with federal funds. One, maintenance of effort, that takes place basically at the state level. So really, it's not something you have to do any calculation with. But essentially, what maintenance of effort means is that your aggregate expenditures to provide educational programs can't be less than 90% of the second preceding year. And what that means is you have to wait for the books to close on 1 year, so you go back to the prior year. So it's a 2-year look back. And if an LEA doesn't meet that 90%, in other words, are you continually cutting costs for your services to your schools, and then are you using your federal money to fill in? And that's what they're looking for here. And if the district fails to meet that 90% requirement, then the state reduces all your federal fund allocations by the proportion by which you failed to make the 90% test. And when they calculate it, they give you the benefit of the doubt. They calculate it multiple ways. Very few districts fail to meet maintenance of effort. And I believe in extreme cases, it's been waived at the federal level, but it is something to watch. If you see your expenditures, per pupil expenditures going down, then you want to keep an eye on that. But again, done at the state level, and they would contact you and just reduce your federal allocations by that much. The next one we have is, I believe, comparability. And so this is it says the third key because it was supplement, not supplant, comparability, maintenance of effort. They're the three biggies that you kind of look at for federal programs, particularly Title I. But comparability, we're going to talk about it in a little bit, but essentially comparability has to do with providing, it's very much like the methodology, you're providing comparable services to your Title I schools. And we'll take a look at that. And this is done at the school level. All right. All right. So again, I keep coming back to intent and purpose because it's become so much more important as we've moved to a plan-based and less of a checklist. If you know what the purpose of the program is, it helps guide you in the right direction. Then you need to go to the grants guidance. Then you go to the individual program requirements. But let's look at some of the intents and purposes of some of the programs. So for Title I, you'll see there's two key criteria included in the purpose of Title I. And the first is academic achievement, okay? Improving academic achievement. And then the second is the focus on the who, and that's students at risk of not meeting state standards. So you can see the what is academic achievement, the who is low achieving students, and this leads to Title I being about closing achievement gaps. And those are the two prongs for Title I to keep in mind. And that's easy to get lost because there's some flexibility in school-wide planning, but it's still academic achievement, at-risk students. Title II is the focus is on achievement through teacher effectiveness, but it also has, again, a focus on academic achievement and also an emphasis on low income and minority students. So ensuring they're not taught by teachers, but to a greater extent by unqualified, effective teachers. So you can see there's a focus, primarily there's a professional development focus there, but teacher effectiveness, and then a focus on certain populations. Although you can support all students, there are requirements in Title II now to prioritize schools with high numbers of low income or minority students. Title III includes two funding sources. It includes Title III English Learner and Title III Immigrant Funds, and those come through two separate funding streams. Essentially, their purpose is merged in the intents and purposes, and there's a dual goal, and one of ensuring English language proficiency and meeting high levels of academic achievement. So it's a two-pronged goal, that it's academic achievement and English proficiency, not one or the other. And also we have supporting teachers in implementing programs, developing the capacity of teachers to help English learners. And finally, parent and family engagement, which was added this year as one of the intents and purposes for Title III. So when you're looking at use of funds, first cut, does it fall under those areas and does it meet the intents and purposes? And Title IV, again, we have those 3 areas, which this year we've had flexibility on. And prior to this, Title IV, you had a percentage required for each of those areas and a limitation on the use of technology, but we have a waiver and there's another waiver pending right now for the 2021. The last waiver was for 1920, and for 2021, they're requesting, and the Department of Education has requested waivers. So CDE is considering it, I believe, in their next board meeting. So this will be going forward. But there are 3 big, and you can see how Title IV is broader than some of these. The 3, those are big chunks, big areas. But in the past, if you received over a certain amount, then you had to ensure that you spent a percentage on each of those. And again, that's been waived for this year, last year, and potentially for next year. All right. So if you look at all the programs together, again, this is kind of what we talked about. Your job is how do all these pieces work together? So if you start, you have LCFF is your base, your basic services, all students, all ethnic groups, all students with disabilities, all your student groups to achieve in state and local priority. That's the foundation. On top of that, you're going to have your LCFF, supplemental, and concentration. Again, you can see a little tighter, focus on increase and improve services for 3 student groups. However, it's a little tighter than the base, but still flexibility in what you can do as long as it's addressing those needs in those student groups. On top of that, our next federal programs, Title II and IV, and that's where we mentioned these are programs you can transfer funds out of these programs, but we caution being careful because you can see we've got a ways to go on this pyramid. There are other more restrictive programs. So professional development in those 3 areas, still has a supplement, not supplant requirement, still is a categorical program, still is restricted funding, but more flexible than some that we're going to look at next. And next would be Title I. So Title I, we looked at the purpose, supplemental funds, academic achievement, students at risk, okay, requires school level allocations, which the others don't. 2 and 4, those are district allocations. So you can make decisions at the district level. Title I is a school level program. So again, you can see it's more restrictive than the others because of that school plan requirement that's embedded in Title I and school allocations, and the fact that it has to supplement your other programs. And then at the top, we have Title III. And Title III, particularly EL programs, Title III is at the top of the pyramid because Title III has to supplement all your state, local, and federal programs. So what does that mean for Title I and III? Well, if you have a school plan, school program, and you have a service available, and an English learner would be eligible for that service. Say you have math tutoring, and you have an English learner who needs math tutoring. Then you need to first support that student with Title I. They have access to that. And then if they need additional help, then you support them with Title III. It doesn't mean you design your Title I program for just English learners. That's not the purpose. Title I's for at-risk students, at risk of meeting state standards. Probably English learners are going to be among those students and can benefit. If they can, they get that service, and then Title III comes on top of it. So you can see that pyramid gives you some food for thought in terms of planning and how you're going to ensure you spend those funds appropriately. All right, so let's look at some of the specific requirements. We're not going to go into details on all of them, but after reviewing the purpose, then we need to look at some of the details in the requirements. So Title I, as we said, it's primarily school level funding based on poverty. Districts are required to rank their schools, and funds are based on poverty, and funds are allocated to schools based on poverty. There are some authorized district reservations, so districts can reserve funds for activities, but only at Title I schools. Services are about closing achievement gaps, students not meeting academic standards or at risk of not meeting them. It's based on a school plan and a comprehensive needs assessment. We have two types of programs, the targeted assistance and school-wide. School-wide definitely triggers a plan because expenditures are based on the plan and what's allowable. And the supplement, not supplant taste, is based on the demonstration of comparable funding to Title I and non-Title I schools through your methodology. So that's some of the key requirements. Also for Title I, on the next slide, plans have to be developed again by the school site council with input from advisory committees, including your EL advisory committee. You can see how there's more requirements added. There's a cap on administrative costs at 15%. There's a carryover limit of 15%, which has been waived for this year. Actually, the state's allowed to approve waivers only once every 3 years, and that's what's been waived. Parental involvement activities and parental involvement policies are required. There's a reservation required for parent engagement and for services for homeless youth. And 90% of that parent engagement has to be, funds have to be allocated to school sites. Okay, so you can, as we talk about restrictive, that continuum of restrictive, there's a lot of requirements embedded here. The key thing to remember, and this is what gets lost, Title I is a program, it's not a funding source. It's not, it's what is your Title I program? And that's a big walk away I hope that you will take. You have to go back to the plan to determine allowability. You can't spend Title I funds without having an approved plan, because the only way you know if a cost is allowable is if it's tied to the plan. So it's not, what can I spend money on, because it's not a funding source. It's a program, and the program determines allowability. All right. So now the question is, what is your Title I program? Again, start with the plan. And that's where it should be described. And then what about reservations? Just a heads up, district level reservations, they need to be described, but they should be included in your school plans. The Fiscal Monitoring Office has told us they will be looking to see for just district reservations described in the school plan, because the funds can only be used at Title I schools, and they would expect schools to know what district services are being provided with the reservation so they can effectively plan. So just a heads up on that. The other question for Title I to keep in mind is, which Title I funds are you talking about? We often get questions, can I spend the Title I on X, Y, Z? And so the question is, well, what funds are you talking about? Are you talking about the funds that are allocated to schools? Okay, well, then you need to look at your school plan. Are you talking about the LEA reservations? Is that for administrative costs? Well, then you have a limit on how much you can spend, and administrative costs have to directly support the Title I program, so it's not generic administration. Secondly, if it's parent involvement reservation, well, remember 90% of that's allocated to the schools. So are we talking about the amount you sent to the schools or money you reserved at the district? There's a reservation for homeless youth. And so the question becomes, how are you supporting those homeless youth with those funds? And then there are district authorized reservations for Title I schools, where those described. And how do you know? If an expenditure supports which purpose there? So when a question comes to you about, can we use Title I funds for this activity? Well, which Title I funds are you talking about? Would be a good first question to ask. Okay. All right. So the question we get sometimes is, a confusion between LCFF, that increase in improved services obligation, and Title I, because there's some similarities, and that causes some confusion. And we thought this helps a little bit, this chart. First of all, if you look at LCFF, here we're looking at the population you're serving are low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. That's who the population is, okay? And the focus is the 8 state priority areas. And any restrictions, they're just that it's increased or improved service, and it's principally directed to one or more of those groups. Now, Title I, the difference is that the population are low achieving students in your highest poverty schools. So Title I is allocated to high poverty schools. There is a poverty factor there. The funds go to schools, but the services are based on academic achievement. So the student population is low achieving students. The focus, academic achievement towards state standards, closing achievement gap, not as broad as the 8 state priorities. Restrictions needs to be supplemental, based on your school plan, developed by the school site council, have an academic need, you have a limit on your administrative costs and carryover. So you can see the differences in those 2 programs. So let's see how that plays out in the real world. So if you have, your district decides they want to do a community-based center to support low-income families, they want scholarships and health services and all kinds of great stuff for students who are low-income families. So think about who the population to be served is. Okay, what do we see? It's low income, right? So the focus is on low income students and families. Does it say here it's only for Title I schools? Do you see anything that says that? No, okay, it didn't say. It's just this is a community. It's for everyone in the community. What's the basis of the need? Okay, it's incomes. It's their income status. Sorry, it's just like school, the gardener. Okay, so the base of the need is not academic. It's based on it, and that's just fine. So what's the most appropriate funding source here? Low income students, not Title I schools. We're looking at their need is based on poverty. Most appropriate funding source is going to be, your proportionality obligation. This appears to be an increased or improved service based on the needs, conditions, and circumstances of your low-income families. So LCFF, great use there. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Okay, Wi-Fi hotspots for students whose parents can't afford them. We've seen a lot of this, okay? Who's the population? All right. Low income. Okay, again, we're looking at parents who can't afford them. Say anything about Title I schools? Don't see it. No. So the basis of the need is income or academic. So income is the base of the need. They're poor. Most appropriate funding source? Okay, once again, your proportionality for LCFF. All right. Let's try another one. Now you have LEA or district-based instructional coaches, and they're going to support teachers with K-3 reading intervention at your Title I schools. All right, but they're going to be district-based coaches, but they're going to be at Title I schools for intervention with reading. The population is who? Yeah, these are K-3 students at risk of not reading at grade level. Only for Title I schools? What did they say? Yes, they said intervention at Title I schools. The basis for the need, is it academic or is it income based? Yeah, Academic need, clearly an academic need. It could be rich or poor in that school. If you're not reading at grade level, you would get services. Most appropriate funding source. Hopefully this one pops out. Is Title I, either a district reservation you could use, or Title I site funds as a centralized service. And tomorrow we'll take a look at how that looks different. What's the difference between reservations and centralized services from school allocations? All right, I think we have another one. And all right, so we're going to resurface the playground at a Title I school. Who's the population we're focused on? Yeah, so I think all the kids are going to be on the playground, right? Is it only for a Title I school? Yeah, it says only for a Title I school. Okay, what's the basis for the need? Academic, income? Neither. It's just basic stuff, right? It's the playground. What's the most appropriate funding source? Yeah, general fund base funds. That's a basic activity. We do now and then see playground repair. Only your EL students out there, okay? This is a basic service. So that's kind of just a 1, 2, 3 and determining which is going to be your appropriate funding source. All right, next is, are we going to look at our, no. Next, we're moving off Title I onto Title II. And Title II is a district level allocation. There's no requirement for a school level allocation. It's district funds. So decisions can be made at the district level. It does include supplement, not supplant, in the old fashioned way, the 3 criteria. It requires a new requirement under ESSA was that you prioritize high poverty schools and schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement. So you should be able to articulate a process for ensuring that you're prioritizing those schools. Title II doesn't have a specified administrative cap, but it has to be reasonable and necessary. And the monitoring office at CDE has used the 15% as what they consider reasonable and necessary. We'll take a look at reasonable and necessary and where that comes from tomorrow. But just know there is no, so you can argue a higher cap, but it has to be reasonable and necessary. And that's kind of their rule of thumb. All right. All right, so next, let's take a look at planning, because Title II has a professional development focus. Let's give you a framework for planning for professional development. You look, we kind of, and I'm sure there are more, but here are the funding sources, many of them, that can be used for professional development. And this is important because professional development has so many funding sources that you can use. You want to figure out, how do I use them most effectively? So if you look up at the top, you're seeing that least restrictive, and that's your general fund. Okay, that's going to be your least restrictive and your S&C obligation. It's unrestricted money. A percentage can be designated to meet your increase and improve services obligation, but no restriction on what you use the funds for. So no timeline for expenditures. There's no, they roll over, no restrictions on timelines. Title II has a requires it to be supplemental to state and local funds, and these are the requirements: improving quality, effectiveness of teachers, principals, school leaders, greater access to teachers for low-income students. So you can see it's a little tighter than your LCFF funds. Still some flexibility. You do have something to keep in mind here, and that's your timeline. You only have 27 months to spend those funds. So you need to keep an eye on how you're spending them, whereas your LCFF funds don't have that timeline. Title IV, again, it's those 3 broad areas of professional development for Title IV. And so again, a little bit maybe more restrictive, 27-month timeline. So again, you move down the timeline. Now we down the list, we come to Title I. Title I, A lot more restrictive. It's for academically at-risk students in high poverty or Title I schools. It needs to be based on a school plan or in the LEA reservation. So a lot more tightness on what you can do. Same 27 months timeline, but you've got a maximum 15% carryover in normal years. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Those funds need to be spent more. Title III is at the bottom, the most restrictive. It's PD and instruction and assessment for English learners. It has to supplement state, local, and federal funds. And again, 27 months to spend it, no carryover. So a question would be a takeaway would be to sit down and look at all the things your district is doing or plans to do for professional development and say, how do we leverage these funds so we're using the right funds and we're using them most effectively, and we're using our least restrictive funds for those things that are more general in nature. Okay, so that's just kind of a planning framework for professional development. Okay, next is, so yeah, just some considerations. You know, what's the purpose of your professional development? Is it focused on a particular student group? Is it a district decision or a school level decision? What about the timelines? Do we have a lot of money? Do we have a lot of money left over from prior years that's about to expire in a certain funding source? Any requirements we need to be careful of? And then what guidance would you give to program planners on that? So just something to consider for your PD planning. Title III, on the next slide. Again, we talk about 2 funding streams for EL and immigrant students. Have to be supplemental not only to your state and local, but to federal funds. For EL, there's a 2% cap on direct administrative costs. And that is, however, you can take your full indirect costs now. That was a change. So 2% cap on direct administrative costs. There is actually no cap for immigrant, but CDE applies the 2% as that reasonable and necessary under that clause. The funds, these are the use of funds, language proficiency, professional development, family engagement, and supplemental activities that enhance and support immigrant youth and students. And then finally, again, a reminder on and this is a reminder for people sometimes are surprised that compliance requirements apply to districts that don't receive Title III funds for English learners, and that's because there are EL requirements outside of Title III. Okay, and this is that same thing we looked at before. Access to core instruction is the what. And the effectiveness is the how are you providing services and how are you evaluating it. And that all encompasses your standard instructional program, which is a core or base fund responsibility. Okay, Title IV last. And it's changed a lot this year, but it you know, requires a plan on how the funds are used. Here are the percentages that typically apply, and all of those are X'd out for this year. The maximum on technology. So you can see for this year, potentially and definitely last year, Title IV had significant flexibility in use of funds. And then a reminder for Title IV, prioritizing, yes. Prioritizing Title IV does include that requirement to prioritize the funds to schools with the greatest needs, the highest percentage of low income students, and your CSI and ATSI schools, as well as persistently dangerous schools. And again, Title IV has a 2% cap on direct administrative costs. Okay, you can take your full indirect costs on it. And the last couple slides are on this section are reminders about equitable services. Just that, equitable services, all 4 formula grants require equitable services for students or for teachers in some cases, in nonprofit private schools and how the services are provided and how the funding is determined is based on the individual program requirements. For all programs except for Title I, it's just the private schools in your district boundaries. And because it's a school level program for Title I, the funds are allocated based on poverty to eligible students who reside in Title I school attendance areas, but they can attend school in other districts. And the CARES Act included a requirement, which was really challenging because it went through numerous court cases and decisions before we finally got clarity on it, but the CARES Act did include it. And then the law said that services would be provided in the same manner as Title I. We got conflicting guidance from the U.S. Department of Education, multiple lawsuits. We're finally back to square one. It is based on poverty. That is how funding is determined for equitable services under CARES. All right. And it only applies to ESSA and GEAR funds because those are the only Department of Education funds. So CR isn't applicable. It's important, especially for the fiscal office, to remember on the next slide that equitable services in groups, including under CARES, requires that the district maintain control of funds, okay? And that means that a provision of services need to be provided either by employees of the LEA or through a contract the LEA has with an individual or organization. It's the district program operated in a private school, okay? Any individual, they have to be under the control and supervision of the LEA. That's why you need to hire them or have them under contract. And all your materials and equipment belong to the district and have to be on your inventory. And we recommend you pull them in annually to review those to make sure that the materials are still there and you pull them in if the program ends. All right. All right, let's do. We are over time, but those of you who are still with us, we're going to finish up real quick. I just want to quickly touch on two types of grants: formula and discretionary grants, and how to make decisions based on that. A lot of first of all, funding changes throughout the year. There are a lot of factors that that change funding. So how do I budget and how do I some of the changes are at the federal level, and they could be a result in changes in other states. Something happens in another state, they're not using their money, trickles down, suddenly we get more money in one of our programs. So I know that people like, why does the money keep changing? That's what happens. And some of those changes are from the state level because we have new or closed charter schools, and that impacts the funding available for all the schools. So they go back and recalculate. Since federal funds are forward funded, you can get an estimate in the spring. They're usually fairly reliable, safe to plan for less, but Title I has a hold harmless clause. And that means you're held harmless at either 85, 90, or 95% of your prior year's amount, all things being equal, unless the whole federal allocation goes down. So unless you had a significant change in your student population, usually your Title I hold harmless should keep you at least a minimum of 15% of what you got in the prior year. So you need to consider local factors. If you had a big change in your population, that can change things. You need to think about, do you have carryover? But for planning purposes, these are some things to keep in your mind. In the spring already, you can get a sense of where your Title I budget's going to be. Okay. And also keep in mind that many of the other grants, how the funding comes depends on the grant itself. So like for Title III, you're going to look at your EL population. For immigrant, you look at your immigrant and did you have a 1% increase? So there are some factors there. Title II and Title IV both have a poverty part of them built in the formula. So in Title II, poverty is part of the formula for allocating the funds to districts. In Title IV, it's connected to your prior year's Title I allocation. So if you don't receive Title I in a current year, you won't get Title IV in the subsequent year. Okay? Formula and discretionary grants. Formula grants are based on one of those formulas we just talked about. And so you can kind of get a sense of how that's going to change. Formula grants all come through the consolidated application. We'll look at that in the next couple sessions. And they don't require a separate application. So Title 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all formula grants that come through the CONAP. CARES and ESSA were based on a formula. CARES Act, I'm sorry, ESSA funds were based on a formula, but they did not come through the CONAP. Discretionary grants are usually competitive in nature, but not always competitive, but they do require a separate application, and the requirements of the grant are embedded in the grant application. So if you want to know what can I do, what can't I do, it's embedded in your grant application. So Title 4B, 21st Century Community Learning Centers, that's a competitive or discretionary grant. CSI is discretionary, although CDE has determined that any CSI school will be eligible, but you have to complete a separate application, which is going to be due later this month, pretty soon. Okay? Other considerations for applying for, when you're determining if you're going to apply for, if you're going to take a formula grant, usually these are just routinely, you just reapply for it. Title 1, 2, yeah, we always did it. But you know, it's worth thinking about how much money is available. For some districts, you really don't get a lot of one of those grant funds, and you look at the requirements and you say, are we going to spend more money administering this grant than we're going to get? What are your administrative cost caps? Like 2% cap on administration doesn't give you much money to administer the program. You might have to put in some additional money for some of those programs for administration. So think about it. What about reporting and accountability? Who's going to do it? How much work? Is your staff and community behind it? Is your board? We've had some districts pull out of certain programs because the board had a philosophical stance against it. Is it aligned to your LEA needs? So do think about formula grants, because rather than just check off, usually the answer is, yeah, we're going to apply for it, but it's worth thinking about it. And sometimes you might want to consider is, if you're experiencing a lot of frustration with a grant program, do we want to reapply? On the other hand, for discretionary grants, usually, I think we have another slide on that, that for those funds, usually people do spend more time thinking about a discretionary grant, because it's not just a rollover, something we do all the time. But you should think about how are decisions made about applying for grants. I mean, what's your process? Do you have a process that you use, or does it just, hey, someone found a grant? Who's involved in that? What's your criteria that you use? Do you have anything in writing somewhere that's like, oh yeah, there's a grant. Let's see, let's tick off. Is there a little form or something you use to say, how's it connected to our priorities as a district? How complicated is the application process? Are we going to have to hire a grant writer to do it? Is there a matching requirement? Because that means you got to cough up some money to put in to match it. Are you willing to do that? What's the evaluation look like? Is there a significant evaluation component to it that's going to cost a lot of money? And are there restrictions on the use of that discretionary grant? Is it really narrow? And is that going to be good for you because it's a good match or not? And then think about conflicts of interest. Is there anything about that grant that would raise a conflict of interest in your district? So just some decision-making tools to think about applying for grants. And I'd highly suggest you have, I know a lot of districts, they have a little checklist they use, and it gives particularly newer people something to go by to say, yeah, this is probably something we want to put forward to cabinet, or maybe not. Okay. All right, so I think we're almost there. Again, I think these are kind of some of the things we talked about, you know, amount of money, alignment to priorities, limitations on overhead and administrative costs, and then time and resources you have to put into it. So just some things to think about at the beginning when you decide, do I even want to apply for these funds? Okay. So just some takeaways, things to take back and think about. And we are over, so we are going to get back to you. And in the Q&A, we're going to pull those questions, and we'll pull the team together and get out responses to you on those, and then come back again tomorrow, and we're going to go a little more in depth into the uniform grant guidance, some terminology, fiscal terminology, and a little bit deeper into the details. It's been a pleasure to see you, at least your names out there. And if you're joining us tomorrow, look forward to it. Otherwise, take care. We'll leave the chat open for just a minute in case you have any other questions. Take care.